The Montana winter had come early that year, painting the world in hues of gray and white, the icy wind biting through the streets of Bozeman. Eleanor Hayes, 25, had always loved the peace of winter, the quiet of the snow-covered mountains, the way the world seemed to pause. But today, all she could feel was the crushing weight of uncertainty. It had started with a letter, a simple final letter from the school board, a few days before the first snowflakes had even fallen. They had cut her salary in half, citing the school's dwindling attendance and budget cuts. And then, after the board had concluded their financial reevaluations, they had given her the final blow. No more teaching, no more job. The position of school teacher in a town that had already seen better days was no longer needed. The small room she had rented from Mrs. Davenport had become just another reminder of her failures. The landlord, an older woman who had never truly approved of Eleanor's independence, had kindly told her she'd need to find somewhere else to stay. The last of her savings had already gone toward keeping the space during the last few weeks. With her job gone and nowhere else to turn, she had packed her things with the bitter taste of hopelessness, unsure of where to go next. By the time the winter storm set in, Eleanor was standing in the doorway of the last place she had ever imagined. Unemployed, penniless, with nothing to hold on to but the tattered coat on her back and the tiny suitcase in her hand. Clutching the straps of her bag, she walked down the empty streets, her boots crunching against the hard-packed snow. She had no destination. She had no family to turn to. No real connections in the town, save for a few students. She had tried to make a life here, but it seemed like it had all crumbled faster than the winter itself. The world felt cold, relentless, and alien to her. That's when she saw him, the cowboy in the distance, standing tall against the backdrop of his sprawling ranch, a silhouette of authority and power that seemed out of place in her life. Thomas Caldwell had been watching Eleanor for weeks, though she hadn't known it. He had come to town often, doing business, and occasionally running into her at the market. A wealthy rancher, widowed for 5 years, Thomas had never needed to explain his wealth or power to anyone. People knew who he was. They respected him out of necessity, not admiration. But respect didn't mean understanding, and it certainly didn't mean warmth. Eleanor had heard of him, of course. The infamous stoic rancher who ran a vast cattle operation with 2 sons, both of whom had grown up too fast without a mother to guide them. His life was a whirlwind of ranching and business, and his home was an island of isolation in a town that had long since stopped being a home for him. But Eleanor never thought much of him. He was a man too busy for frivolities like relationships, much less a school teacher who had struggled to make ends meet. She had been wrong. It was the storm that brought them together. With nowhere to go and no place to stay, Eleanor had found herself at a crossroads. The inn had been full, and she had tried every door she could think of. But that evening, as she walked toward the church to find a refuge, she had seen him, the tall figure of Thomas Caldwell, riding toward her on horseback, his face hardened by years of solitary work. He stopped just short of her, his boots crunching into the snow as he dismounted. "Miss Hayes?" He greeted her, his voice deep with an undertone of something she couldn't quite place. "I've been looking for you." Eleanor blinked in surprise. She had never spoken to him outside of casual pleasantries, and yet here he was, addressing her as if he had been expecting her. She nodded, confused and wary. "Is something the matter?" she asked, her voice shaking from the cold, her breath visible in the frigid air. Thomas didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, as if considering the best way to approach her, then spoke in his usual direct manner, his eyes never leaving her. "You need shelter, don't you?" Eleanor nodded without hesitation. The fear of the unknown had started to gnaw at her, the prospect of spending another night in the streets filling her with dread. She had no idea what Thomas was getting at, but she didn't care anymore. She needed help. Thomas paused, looking at her for a moment longer. Then, in his typical blunt manner, he stated, "I'm offering you a solution." His voice had an odd finality to it, as if he had already made up his mind. "I need a wife. You need security. I've got the house. I've got the land. I've got the money. All I need is someone to help me with the boys and manage the household. And you need someone to take you in for the winter." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her first instinct was to recoil. A marriage of convenience. The idea seemed absurd, yet here was this man offering it to her, as if it were the simplest arrangement in the world. She had heard of such things, arranged marriages made for practical reasons, especially out in the West, but she had never imagined she would be part of one. Her eyes met his, and she saw no hesitation in his face. His offer wasn't one of romance or affection. It was cold, logical, a solution to both of their problems. Still, it wasn't an easy decision for Eleanor. Her pride, as much as her need, was screaming inside her. Could she accept this man's proposal? Was she willing to give up her autonomy for the sake of survival? After a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper, Eleanor asked, "And what do you want in return?" Thomas's gaze softened ever so slightly. "I need a mother for my boys, Eleanor. I can't do this alone anymore. You'll have your shelter and security, and I'll have someone to help guide my sons, that's all." Eleanor hesitated. Her pride, her desire for independence, clashed violently with the cold reality of her situation. The storm was worsening. She had no job, no prospects, no family, and this man, who seemed to offer everything she lacked, was now standing before her with a proposal that seemed too practical, too simple to be real. But it was. She could see it in his eyes. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a business deal. And for her, it might just be the only chance for survival. "I'll accept." Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. Thomas nodded, his face betraying no emotion, though she could see the faintest flicker of something, a relief, gratitude. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Then let's get you inside." The house that Thomas Caldwell called home was large, almost too large for one man to handle, let alone a woman with no experience in managing such a sprawling property. It had been built by Thomas's late wife, Margaret, with an eye for practicality over warmth. The rooms were spacious and well furnished, but there was a coldness to the house that no amount of sunlight could cure. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the hearth in the living room had long since gone cold, a relic of the past. For Thomas, this house was a symbol of his success, of everything he had built since coming to Montana. But it was also a prison. The rooms were filled with memories of Margaret, a woman who had once breathed life into this place, who had loved him and their two sons, Samuel and Daniel, with a passion that still echoed in the corners of the house. It was impossible to escape those memories, even now, 5 years after her death. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, feeling the weight of the house's history settle on her shoulders. She had entered this marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate need for shelter. It was a marriage of necessity, one that had been born from practicality. But the reality of living in this house, a place so alien to her, struck her with an overwhelming sense of displacement. Thomas had been clear about their arrangement. They would live separate lives under one roof. Eleanor would manage the household, care for the boys, and maintain the ranch's day-to-day operations. Thomas would continue to run his cattle business and take care of the things that required his attention. They would be a family, but only in name. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Thomas standing in the hallway, his posture rigid, his face as unreadable as ever. He looked every bit the part of the rancher, tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of hard work and exposure to the elements. There was a certain air of authority about him, but it wasn't the kind that invited intimacy. It was the kind of authority that demanded respect, not connection. "It's a big house, Eleanor." His voice was low, almost too low to hear, but there was an edge to it, a kind of detached concern. "You'll have plenty of room to make yourself comfortable, but remember, this isn't a home for you yet. It's just a place to survive until the storm passes." The words stung more than she expected, though she didn't show it. She had known from the beginning that this would not be a marriage built on affection, but there was something about the way he said it, so coldly, so pragmatically, that made her feel like a stranger in a house that should have felt like a refuge. Eleanor nodded, swallowing the words that were rising in her throat. "I understand, Thomas. I'm not here to disrupt your life. I'm here to help you." Thomas seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But then he turned away, as if the conversation was already over. "Good." It was a momentary silence before he added, "Dinner is in an hour. The boys will be joining us. You should get used to the routine here." Eleanor stood still as Thomas walked away, the quiet weight of his words settling in her chest. She had no illusions about the nature of their agreement. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here, something that went beyond the practicalities of running a household and raising children. The first few days in the Caldwell household passed in a blur of routines and tasks. Eleanor found herself in the kitchen, preparing meals, washing clothes, and organizing the house, all while trying to find a semblance of normalcy. The boys, Samuel and Danielle, were a challenge. Samuel, the younger of the two, was curious and eager to learn, but Daniel, the older son, kept his distance, his eyes full of suspicion whenever Eleanor approached. Eleanor had spent the last few years teaching in a small rural school, so she was accustomed to children. But Samuel and Daniel were different. They had grown up without a mother, and the scars of that absence were clear. Samuel, at least, seemed willing to accept her presence in his life. He asked questions, followed her around, and was eager to learn about the world. But Daniel was a different story. He was reserved, quiet, and defensive. It wasn't hard for Eleanor to understand why. He was no longer a child, not really. He had been thrust into the role of a caretaker long before he should have been, and his father's aloofness only deepened the divide. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat at the kitchen table reviewing the boys' schoolwork, Samuel came running into the room, his face alight with excitement. Miss Hayes, I learned my letters today." He grinned, his cheeks flushed with pride. Eleanor couldn't help but smile, her heart warmed by the boy's enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, Samuel. Let's see what you can do." Samuel pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket, and with an exaggerated flourish, He began to write out the letters he had learned. As Eleanor watched him, she realized how much this boy craved attention, craved approval. He needed someone to see him, to guide him. And Eleanor, despite everything, felt a growing affection for him. "That's very good, Samuel," she said, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "You're learning fast. Keep it up." But as she turned to place the paper on the table, she caught sight of Daniel standing in the doorway. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his expression was one of quiet disdain. He didn't say anything, but Eleanor could feel the weight of his gaze on her. "Is there something wrong, Daniel?" she asked gently, her voice soft. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked away, his jaw clenched tightly. "No, just, I don't need help." His words were sharp, almost dismissive. Eleanor could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken distance between them. She had expected this. Daniel had been through too much to simply accept a stranger in his life. He was old enough to understand the weight of what had happened, the absence of his mother, and the unfamiliarity of Eleanor's presence. "You don't have to do this alone, Daniel," Eleanor said quietly, her voice softening. "You don't have to push everyone away. I'm here to help you, to help both of you." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor and Samuel in silence. That evening, as Eleanor prepared the meal, she couldn't shake the feeling of isolation that had settled into her bones. She had come here to help, to make a difference, but the reality of living in Thomas Caldwell's house, of stepping into a family that had already been shattered, was more difficult than she had imagined. When Thomas joined them at the table, his presence seemed to fill the room. His demeanor was cold, his posture stiff, as he took his seat at the head of the table. Samuel, sitting beside Eleanor, tried to make conversation, but Thomas was distant, his focus on his meal rather than on his family. Eleanor couldn't help but notice the absence of warmth, of connection. She had known from the beginning that this would not be a marriage of love. But it wasn't just about the two of them. It was about the boys, about trying to create a family from the ashes of something that had once been whole. After dinner, Samuel finished his plate and ran off to play in the yard. Eleanor cleared the table in silence, her thoughts spinning as she worked. Thomas remained seated, his gaze distant, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry." Eleanor paused, glancing up at him. "What for?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands folding in front of him. "For not being more present. I know this is hard for you, but it's hard for me too, for all of us. I just don't know how to make it right." Eleanor felt a flicker of something stir within her. Sympathy, perhaps, or something else. She had seen the hardness in Thomas before. The man who had built his life through sheer will. The man who buried his emotions under layers of practicality. But now, for the first time, she saw a crack in the facade. A small, vulnerable part of him was emerging. "I understand, Thomas. I do." She set the dishes aside, wiping her hands on a towel. "We all have our burdens, but we can't do this alone, not if we want to make it work." For a moment, Thomas didn't respond, but his eyes softened, just a little, and he nodded. "We'll try." His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "For the boys, for all of us." Eleanor nodded, the weight of their shared understanding settling over her like a warm blanket. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The weeks that followed Eleanor's arrival at the Caldwell Ranch passed slowly, but with purpose. There was always something to do, something to fix, something that needed her attention. The routine, as she had been warned, quickly became familiar. Fixing meals, tending to the house, managing the boys' schooling, and attempting to maintain order in a home that, despite its size and beauty, felt like a ghost of a family long past. Clara found solace in the quiet work, but it was also a reminder of how far from home she truly was. Though she had known what she was getting into when she'd agreed to Thomas's proposal, the reality was much colder than she had imagined. Thomas, while respectful, remained distant, as if each day he too was learning to navigate this strange arrangement. She could feel his presence around the house, his footsteps in the hallways, his deep voice occasionally calling for one of the boys. But there was a gap between them that neither seemed willing to cross. His interactions with her were polite, yet distant. His focus was always on the ranch, his business, his sons. But as the days turned into weeks, Eleanor couldn't ignore the weight of the unspoken between them. There was something more to their arrangement than just practicality. At least, there had to be. She wasn't sure if it was the warmth of the house, the growing affection she felt for the boys, or something else entirely. But every passing day chipped away at the walls between them, slowly but surely. Samuel, the younger of Thomas's sons, was a curious and quick-witted child, and Eleanor found herself drawn to him almost immediately. His bright eyes and eager nature reminded her of the students she had once taught, those who hung on every word and wanted so desperately to learn. Teaching Samuel was a challenge and a joy. His enthusiasm for learning, though at times overwhelming, brought a lightness to the otherwise heavy silence in the house. One afternoon, Eleanor was sitting at the dining table, writing out a lesson plan for the boys, when Samuel burst into the room, his face flushed with excitement. Miss Hayes, look!" he exclaimed, practically bouncing on his feet. Eleanor looked up from her papers, smiling at his energy. "What is it, Samuel?" With wide eyes, Samuel placed a small bird's nest on the table, a delicate bundle of twigs and feathers. "I found this by the fence. Do you think it's a robin's nest? I've been reading about them, and I think it is." Eleanor gently picked up the nest, turning it over in her hands. "I think you're right. This is a robin's nest, Samuel. How did you know?" "Well, robins have these blue eggs, don't they? And this nest has that exact shape. I wanted to show you because I've been practicing all the things you taught me about animals and nature." He beamed, waiting for her approval. "That's wonderful, Samuel. You're doing great." She ruffled his hair affectionately, her heart swelling with pride. Samuel was a bright boy, eager for knowledge, but she could sense the underlying loneliness in him. His curiosity seemed to be a way of filling the emptiness left by his mother's absence. Despite her growing bond with Samuel, Eleanor knew that the real challenge was with Daniel, Thomas's older son. Daniel, though outwardly polite, had made it clear from the start that he didn't want Eleanor in his life. He kept his distance, spending most of his time outside, either tending to the animals or simply avoiding the house altogether. He rarely spoke to Eleanor, and when he did, his tone was curt, as though he was humoring her rather than engaging. One evening, after dinner, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the ranch. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful in its vastness, but also isolating. She longed for the familiar bustle of a classroom, the chatter of students, the sense of purpose that had once filled her days. But that life felt like a distant memory now. "I need to speak with you." The voice came from behind her, quiet but firm. Eleanor turned around, startled to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The way he stood, his feet planted firmly, his jaw set, reminded her so much of Thomas, and yet there was something softer about Daniel, something she couldn't quite place. "About what?" Eleanor asked, her voice gentle. She hadn't expected him to come to her, but she knew this was the moment they needed to have a conversation. Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. I just thought you should know that I don't want you here." The words stung more than Eleanor expected, and she felt her heart tighten in her chest. "I understand, Daniel. I know this isn't easy for you, but I'm here because I want to help." She kept her voice steady, though inside her emotions were running wild. "I'm not trying to replace your mother." Daniel scoffed, turning his gaze away. "You can't replace her. No one can." His voice was sharp, but there was a tremor in it, a vulnerability he hadn't let show before. Eleanor took a step closer, her voice softening. "I'm not trying to replace her. I just want to help, Daniel. I want to make sure you and Samuel are okay." Daniel looked at her then, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the pain in his eyes. "I don't need anyone's help. I've been taking care of everything since she died." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought he might cry. But then, just as quickly, he regained his composure, pushing the emotion back down. "I don't need you to step in now." Eleanor understood then. This wasn't about her. This was about him. He didn't want to accept that someone else, especially a stranger, could fill the role of a mother, even temporarily. His words cut, but she knew they weren't really about her. They were about his own fear of being abandoned again. "I'm not trying to take her place, Daniel," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm just here to help you both in whatever way I can. I don't want to replace anyone. I just want to be someone you can count on." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room without another word. As the days went by, the tension between Eleanor and Daniel persisted, though the younger boy, Samuel, seemed to grow closer to her with each passing day. He had started calling her Mama, though she knew it wasn't meant to replace Margaret. It was just his way of finding comfort in a world that had changed too suddenly. Samuel still had his moments of sadness, but Eleanor could see the spark in him when he was learning, when he was engaging with the world. But it wasn't just the boys that Eleanor had to navigate. It was Thomas. He had been kind, if distant, since their first days together, and their interactions, while polite, had remained strictly formal. She had been aware from the start that this was not a marriage born from love or affection. It was an agreement, a partnership based on necessity. Thomas needed someone to care for the boys, and Eleanor needed a roof over her head. But what neither of them had anticipated was the slow shift that began to happen between them. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Eleanor found herself alone in the living room. The fire in the hearth was low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She had been reading a book she'd found in the library, but her mind kept drifting. Her thoughts were filled with Thomas, his distance, his quiet moments, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. She was startled when she heard his footsteps approach. Thomas stopped in the doorway, his broad figure framed by the dim light. "Eleanor." His voice was quieter than usual, almost uncertain. "I wanted to talk to you." Eleanor closed the IE book, setting it aside. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Thomas stepped into the room, moving closer to the fire. his hands thrust on the back of a chair as he faced her, his gaze searching. I'm not good at this. His words were simple, but heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. You've been here for a while now, and I can see you're trying with the boys, with the house. And I appreciate it. I do. But it's hard for me. It's hard to let go of what was, to accept that things have changed. Eleanor felt a knot form in her chest. She had known Thomas was grieving. She had seen it in the way he moved through the house, the way he avoided his sons, the way he buried himself in work. But hearing him admit it made something shift in her, something she hadn't anticipated. I understand, Thomas. I really do. Change is hard for everyone, especially after losing someone you loved so much. But we're here now, and we have a chance to build something real. Thomas turned to her then, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. I never thought I would find someone who could fill the space she left behind. I didn't want to, but now, I'm not so sure. I think I've been hiding from it, from the idea of moving on. Eleanor felt a rush of empathy for him. She had never expected this to be easy, but hearing him voice his doubts made her realize just how complicated everything was, how much he was still holding back. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Thomas. I'm just here to help, but if you want something more, something real, I'm willing to try. For the first time, Thomas looked at her, not with the cool detachment he had worn since they first met, but with something else, a flicker of possibility. It was fleeting, but it was there. Maybe we both need time, he said, his voice quieter now, but I'm willing to give it a chance. And for the first time, Eleanor realized that despite the cold beginning, there was a foundation here, a foundation that could be built upon. It wouldn't be easy, but it might just be worth it. The days grew colder, the winter deepening its grip on the ranch. Snow piled high on the fences, and the wind howled relentlessly through the cracks in the old farmhouse. For Eleanor, the isolation was beginning to wear on her, the monotony of her new life setting in. She had never expected to settle so easily into the rhythm of the ranch, but here she was, managing Thomas's household, guiding the boys through their lessons, and trying to make the best of the cold, empty house that surrounded them. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was life. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to accept that maybe, just maybe, this was enough. But despite the steady progress of their day-to-day tasks, there was still a heavy weight in the house, an invisible barrier between Eleanor and Thomas. The marriage, though born out of necessity, had yet to evolve beyond that. A mutual arrangement to fill a need. There was no warmth between them, not in the way Eleanor had hoped. She had tried to be patient, to allow time for the space between them to soften, but every day felt like they were drifting further apart. Eleanor spent much of her time with Samuel. The boy had flourished under her attention, his bright mind soaking up every bit of knowledge she shared. He was eager, and he had a thirst for learning that made her heart swell with pride. But Daniel, the older son, remained a challenge. He had distanced himself further from Eleanor, spending more and more time outside, away from the house. And despite his occasional attempts at politeness, Eleanor could sense the resentment bubbling beneath his calm exterior. It was on one of those cold mornings, as Eleanor stepped out into the barn to check on the animals, that the first real crack in the wall between her and Thomas appeared. The barn was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of hooves and the occasional snort from one of the cows. Eleanor had spent much of the morning feeding the animals, checking on the hay stores, and organizing the feed. The work was mundane but comforting, a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. She was about to head back to the house when she heard the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Turning, Eleanor saw Thomas approaching, his face set in its usual hard expression. He had been working outside all morning, dealing with cattle, but there was something different about him today. The tension between them had been building for weeks, but now it felt as though it was coming to a head. "Eleanor," Thomas called out as he neared. His voice was low, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "We need to talk." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "About what?" Thomas stopped a few feet away from her, his boots leaving deep impressions in the snow. "About everything. About you and the boys. About us." Eleanor didn't know what to say. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the familiar sense of unease creeping in. She hadn't expected this conversation, not like this, but she knew deep down that it was inevitable. "What's going on with Daniel?" Thomas asked, his voice softer now, though the tension in his words was still evident. "He's been avoiding you, and I don't know how to fix it." Eleanor sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know either. He's just angry. He doesn't want me here. He wants things to go back to the way they were, and I'm not sure I can change that." Thomas stared at her for a moment, his eyes dark. "You're doing your best, Eleanor, but it's not just about Daniel. It's about me, too, about what this is." Eleanor swallowed, the cold air biting at her skin. "What do you mean?" Thomas took a step closer, his breath coming out in soft clouds. "I don't know how to be a husband again. I don't know how to let someone in." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time since their marriage, Eleanor saw a flicker of something other than detachment in his eyes. It was vulnerability. "I've been trying to keep everything together, trying to make this work, but it's not working." Eleanor's chest tightened at the admission. She had known that he had been struggling, but hearing him say it out loud made something in her break. She had been trying so hard to make this work, to make them a family, and yet there he was, standing in front of her, admitting that he couldn't even try to love her. "I'm sorry," Thomas continued, his voice low. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know what else to do." Eleanor stood still for a moment, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She had known all along that their marriage wasn't going to be easy, but she hadn't realized how hard it would be for both of them. She had hoped in the back of her mind that over time things would shift, that the coldness between them would warm into something real. But now she wasn't sure it could ever be more than this. A cold, pragmatic arrangement. "I understand, Thomas," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But I can't keep pretending either. I can't keep pouring everything into something that doesn't have the same in return." Thomas didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, watching her, as if he were waiting for her to change her mind. But Eleanor knew she couldn't. She had given so much to this marriage already, her pride, her hopes, her future. And if it wasn't going to turn into something more, then she needed to let go. "I'm not asking for love, Eleanor." Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but firm. "I'm asking for partnership, for us to be a family. But I know it's going to take time." Eleanor nodded slowly, a lump forming in her throat. "We'll have to take it one day at a time then." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken realization that things could never go back to what they were. They weren't just two strangers living under the same roof. They were people, broken in different ways, trying to rebuild what they had lost. Whether or not that would ever turn into love, neither of them could say. That evening, as Eleanor sat at the table with the boys, the weight of the conversation with Thomas still pressed heavily on her heart. Samuel sat beside her, excitedly showing her a new book he had found in the library, eager to share his knowledge. His innocence was a balm for Eleanor's heart, and she smiled at him, grateful for the distraction. Daniel, however, sat at the far end of the table, barely touching his food, his eyes trained on the window. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself and went to the kitchen to clean up. She was trying to focus on the task at hand, scrubbing the dishes, wiping the counters. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas's words. The fragile thread of trust between them had been tested, and she wasn't sure where they stood now. Just as she finished drying the last dish, Thomas appeared in the doorway. This time, his posture was different, less guarded, less sure. He stepped into the kitchen slowly, as if he weren't sure whether to speak or to leave her in peace. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for me either. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done, for being here, for helping with the boys." Eleanor turned, meeting his gaze. "I'm doing what I can, Thomas. I'm not asking for anything more." Thomas nodded, but there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of understanding, of shared grief. "You're more than just a mother for the boys, Eleanor. You're more than just someone to help. You're someone I've come to depend on." The words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. In that moment, Eleanor realized something. Thomas wasn't just a man she had married out of necessity. He was a man she was learning to care for. Slowly, carefully, he was becoming a part of her life. But the path ahead was uncertain. They both knew it. They had started out with no promises, no expectations. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something real was there. Somewhere in the quiet moments between them, in the gentle conversations, in the shared struggles. "I'm not going anywhere, Thomas," Eleanor said softly. "But we need to figure this out. Together." Thomas nodded, his face softening. "We will." And for the first time since they had married, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, in time, their partnership could become something more. As winter deepened its hold on the Caldwell Ranch, the once quiet home began to pulse with an underlying current of change. The snow piled higher around the property, isolating them further from the world outside. But in the midst of the cold, something unexpected was happening. Something neither Eleanor nor Thomas had anticipated when they first entered this arrangement. They were beginning to learn how to live together, to rely on each other in ways neither had imagined. For Eleanor, the change was subtle at first. It started with the way Thomas's voice softened when he spoke to her. Small things, like his nods of acknowledgement when she entered a room. The way he had begun to include her in conversations about the ranch. He had stopped treating her like a mere caretaker and started to see her as a partner in the truest sense, though neither of them was ready to call it that yet. Their relationship, still far from perfect, had begun to shift in ways that were hard to define. Eleanor's growing affection for the boys, Samuel's curious questions and eager learning, Daniel's occasional softening toward her, became a cornerstone of her life here. But more than that, it was the unspoken moments with Thomas, when their eyes met across the room, or when their hands brushed while passing a dish at dinner, that made her feel a glimmer of hope that perhaps one day, this marriage of necessity could become something more. Despite their progress, there were still difficult moments, and none was more difficult than when the ranch faced its first real external challenge. A challenge that would test not only their survival, but the fragile trust they had built. It came on a particularly cold morning, just as the sun had begun to rise, casting pale rays of light over the snow-covered ground. Thomas had been up before dawn, as was his habit, tending to the cattle. But as Eleanor was getting ready for the day, she heard the sound of horses riding fast, the clatter of hooves pounding against the snow. The sound was urgent, and it sent a ripple of unease through her. She moved quickly to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered outside. A group of men was approaching the ranch, their faces covered with scarves against the biting wind. At the front of the group was a man Eleanor recognized, Jasper Lowe, one of the local ranchers who had never hidden his disdain for her marriage to Thomas. He was known for his hard demeanor and his association with some of the rougher elements of the town. Eleanor's heart raced as she watched them approach. She didn't need to be told what was happening. She knew this was about the ranch, about Thomas's land, and about the growing threat of the rustlers who had been plaguing the region for months. She quickly bundled herself up and went outside, her boots crunching in the snow as she made her way toward the barn. Thomas had already seen them coming and was standing by the fence, his posture rigid, his face tense. The boys, Samuel and Daniel, were standing behind him, their expressions wary. "What's going on?" Eleanor asked, moving to stand beside Thomas. Thomas didn't immediately answer. His eyes remained fixed on the group of men approaching. "Rustlers, they're trying to intimidate us into selling." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. She had heard rumors of rustlers moving through the region, targeting ranchers who were struggling to hold on to their land. But she had never imagined they would come for Thomas. They had been quiet for weeks, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. "They'll want something from you, Thomas." Eleanor's voice was calm, though her heart was racing. "What are you going to do?" Thomas turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "What I have to." Before she could ask him what that meant, Jasper Lowe and his group arrived at the barn, dismounting their horses with practiced ease. They were men hardened by the land, rough and mean in their appearance, their eyes cold and calculating. "Thomas," Jasper greeted him with a forced smile, "I think it's time we had a little chat about your land." Thomas didn't answer right away. He simply looked at them, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He wasn't a man to be intimidated, but Eleanor could see the weight of the situation settling on him. He didn't want to engage in a confrontation, but the men surrounding them weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take. "What do you want, Jasper?" Thomas finally asked, his voice low but firm. Jasper took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "Your land. We've been patient, Thomas, but you're barely holding on to it as it is. I think it's time you sold." Eleanor watched as Thomas's jaw tightened. He had been under pressure before, dealing with the constant struggle of keeping the ranch afloat, but this was different. These men weren't just looking to buy, they were looking to force his hand. "This land isn't for sale, Jasper," Thomas said firmly, "and it never will be." The tension in the air thickened, and Eleanor felt her heart race. She had no idea what Jasper and his men were capable of, but she knew they weren't here for a friendly chat. "Then we'll take it from you," Jasper said, his smile slipping into something colder, more menacing. "The land, the cattle, everything. You can either sell it to us or watch it burn. Your choice, Thomas." Eleanor's stomach tightened at the threat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. They were going to take everything from Thomas, everything he had worked for, everything that had been passed down to him. But Thomas didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "If you think you can take it, then try, but I won't give up without a fight." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then, without warning, Thomas stepped forward, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. The message was clear. He wasn't backing down. Jasper raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need for violence, Thomas. We're just making a deal here. But you'll have to make a choice soon. You can't hold on to everything forever." Thomas didn't say anything in return. Instead, he motioned for the men to leave. "Get off my land, Jasper, and take your threats with you." Jasper hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but he knew better than to provoke Thomas further. With a grunt, he turned and motioned for his men to follow him. "This isn't over," Jasper called over his shoulder as he climbed onto his horse. "We'll be back." Eleanor watched as the group rode off, the tension in the air slowly dissipating, though she could still feel the weight of their words hanging over them. "Are you okay?" she asked, turning to Thomas, her voice soft. He didn't answer right away. He simply stared after the group, his expression hard. Finally, he looked at her, his face softening just slightly. "I'm fine, but this isn't the end. We'll need to prepare for whatever comes next." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. She had known this day would come, the day when the land would no longer be enough to protect them. But this was more than just a threat to Thomas's ranch. It was a threat to their family, to everything they had built. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Eleanor found herself standing at the window once again, staring out at the snow-covered fields. The storm was gathering again, the wind picking up. But it wasn't just the weather that was making her uneasy. It was everything that had happened today. The threat from the rustlers wasn't just about cattle or land. It was about survival. It was about the very foundation of their lives. Eleanor turned as she heard Thomas approaching. He didn't speak at first, but she could sense his unease. "What are we going to do?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet. Thomas hesitated, then spoke, his voice steady but firm. "We prepare. We defend what's ours." Eleanor could hear the resolve in his voice, and something stirred within her. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore. This was about family, and Eleanor wasn't about to let anyone tear apart the family they were starting to build, no matter the cost. "I'll stand with you, Thomas, whatever it takes." He met her gaze, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something different in his eyes, something softening, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of trust. "We'll do this together." The storm had arrived as promised, shaking the foundations of the house and battering the land with its ferocious winds. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, smothering everything in its path. It had been an unsettling few days since the rustlers' last visit, and now the storm seemed to carry a foreboding message. The ranch, still vulnerable from the threats that loomed on the horizon, felt even more isolated than ever. It wasn't just the physical separation of the land or the snow. It was the growing tension in the house, the ever-present awareness of the danger that hung over them. For Eleanor, sleep had been difficult to come by. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, made her heart race. She couldn't shake the image of the rustlers riding off that day, their words echoing in her mind. This isn't over, they had said. Eleanor had known from the moment she agreed to this marriage that her life would never be simple. What she hadn't expected was the depth of her feelings for Thomas, for the boys. She had come here looking for shelter and security, but now, after months of living together, she realized she was fighting for something far greater. She was fighting for a future, not just for herself, but for the family she had come to love. Despite everything, despite the walls that still stood between her and Thomas, she was committed to making this work. She had given up too much to turn back now. The morning arrived cold, crisp, and gray. Eleanor was awake early, the dawn breaking through the small window of the kitchen, casting its pale light onto the snowy landscape. The house was still, and for a moment the silence felt comforting. But as she prepared the morning's breakfast, a growing sense of unease weighed heavily in the air. The storm had passed, but it had left behind something more ominous, a lingering uncertainty that made every action feel more significant, as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She had heard the sounds first, the rapid clattering of hooves against the snow, the unmistakable sound of men riding hard. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the window. The figures on horseback were drawing closer, a group of men moving fast, their faces obscured by scarves against the bitter cold. She didn't need to ask who they were. She knew the rustlers were back. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she watched them ride across the fields, their movements purposeful. There were 6 of them, all armed, and they weren't here for a friendly visit. They had come to claim what they believed was theirs. The weight of the situation settled heavily on her chest. They weren't just coming for cattle, they were coming for everything, the land, the ranch, Thomas's livelihood. She didn't have to wait long before Thomas appeared, walking briskly toward the barn. His figure stood out against the whiteness of the snow, his tall, broad frame seemingly unbothered by the frigid wind. Eleanor followed him, her mind racing with the enormity of what was about to unfold. Thomas had been preparing for this. She knew that, but she hadn't imagined it would come to this fast. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering anxiety in her chest. Thomas didn't turn to look at her. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the men approaching. "We need to make sure they know we're not backing down." Eleanor watched as he moved toward the barn, gathering the men who had arrived earlier in the week to help fortify their defenses. The ranch had become a battleground of sorts, and now, more than ever, it felt like it was just them against the world. As the group of men gathered near the fence, preparing weapons, she couldn't help but feel a surge of unease. They had prepared as best as they could, but how could they know what was coming? How could they predict the violence these men would bring? Eleanor stood by the barn door, watching the men as they organized, her fingers clutching the rifle in her hands. She had never thought she would be in a situation like this. She had never thought that she would be standing on the brink of a fight, not just for the ranch, but for everything she had come to care about. The boys, the life she was building with Thomas, everything. As the rustlers grew closer, Eleanor's mind raced. She had no experience with this kind of violence, with defending a home under threat. But she couldn't allow herself to be afraid. They had made it this far, and they couldn't back down now. Not when everything was on the line. Not when their lives, their future was at stake. When the rustlers finally reached the boundary of the ranch, Thomas stepped forward, meeting them in the center of the yard. The men behind him were positioned at various points around the property, rifles aimed and ready, prepared for whatever would come next. "I've warned you before," Thomas called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "This land isn't for sale." Jasper Lowe, the leader of the group, slid off his horse and approached Thomas with a sneer. "You should have listened, Thomas. It's too late for words now." The tension in the air was palpable, every breath seeming to hang suspended between them. Eleanor's grip on the rifle tightened as she watched the exchange, the cold seeping into her bones. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore, it was about survival. The rustlers had made it clear they weren't going to leave without a fight, and Thomas wasn't going to give up without one either. "You can't just come here and take what you want," Thomas said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I'm not giving up this land. Not to you. Not to anyone." Jasper's eyes darkened, and for a moment it seemed like the entire world held its breath. "Then you'll see how hard we fight for it." Without warning, the first shot rang out. The noise shattered the quiet of the ranch, and chaos erupted. Eleanor ducked instinctively, her heart hammering in her chest. The men on both sides fired in quick succession, the crack of the shots piercing the air as hooves thundered across the snow. Eleanor's hands shook as she raised her rifle, but she didn't hesitate. She had been trained to shoot, and now she would use that training. The rustlers had underestimated them, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The next few minutes were a blur. Gunfire, shouting, the sound of hooves pounding against the snow, the wind howling in the distance. Eleanor focused on the task at hand, on staying steady, on defending the ranch. She fired when necessary, her movements automatic, her mind clear despite the chaos around her. When the dust settled, the rustlers had retreated, pulling back into the woods at the edge of the property. The remaining men who had joined Thomas were catching their breath, wiping the sweat from their brows, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of further danger. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse as he approached her. Eleanor nodded, though her legs felt weak beneath her. She had been part of the fight, but the reality of what had just happened was beginning to settle in. They had won, this time. But what about the next time and the time after that? "We're safe for now," Thomas said, as if reading her thoughts. "But we need to be prepared. This isn't over." Eleanor glanced at him, her heart racing. There was something different in his eyes now, something softer. The fear, the distance had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. He was no longer just a man who had brought her here out of necessity. He was someone she had come to trust, someone she cared for. "We'll be ready," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "We'll do this together, Eleanor." The storm that had raged outside had subsided, but Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning. They had faced the first test together, and they had come out victorious. But there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, and she would stand by Thomas's side through every one of them.